Coming up on the Men at the Movies podcast, we kick off the new year with King Arthur, Legend of the Sword. This story is a reflection on a man's struggle with power. In Vortigern, we see a man who wants more power and will do anything and sacrifice anyone to get it. But in Arthur, we see a man who doesn't want the power that is his. But because of his upbringing, because of his initiation, he's become a man who can be entrusted with power. Because he's become a man of character. Character is developed through suffering, but the best predictor of potential is the ability to fail without getting discouraged. So join us and let's discover God's truth in this movie.
The movies and stories we love are gateways to see ourselves and God in new ways.
Every great story borrows its power from a larger story, the story that's written on our hearts and woven into the fabric of our very being. Hello and welcome to the Men at the Movies podcast. My name is Paul McDonald, and joining me, I've got a new first-time guy welcoming to the podcast, Clay Eaton. Hey, Clay, how you doing today, man?
I'm doing good, Paul. Thanks for having me.
And if you're listening, if you're not watching this on the YouTube channel, you're not going to see it. But Clay has one of the best backgrounds I've ever had for a guest. It makes me a little jealous. He's got tools everywhere, and not just tools everywhere, but they're like organized. So I'm feeling some jealousy, a little bit of envy for your organization there in the background of your shed there, Clay.
They're only organized because I lose everything, and so they have to be sitting in the right spot or they're gone. And I'm only in this background because I'm hiding from 3 noisemakers in the house. So.
Well, we hope that they'll leave you alone for a little bit. So because and if they come in, they come in. We'll welcome them on the podcast. So Clay and I met last November at a Wild at Heart event called Survival School. And Clay, what was one of your takeaways from that event? How has that impacted your life? This is one of those questions I warned you about that pop into my head as we're talking that we didn't talk about beforehand.
That's all right. You can bring them on. I think the main impact there was tons of good stuff from that, but the main impact that I feel like I've noticed is just the idea that an intimate life with God and walking with the Father is just, it's not an option. It's just it's a must do. It has to be part of not even the routine. It has to be the focus of the day. And so, rather than try to figure out like, how am I going to fit more God into whatever else I have going on, just the idea of like, start with God and then see where the day goes from there, to a fault almost.
Yeah. The God will always provide, right? You were talking and I'm like, I got that idea. I've seen the time management stuff where you have a jar and you try to fill it with stuff. But if you start with the small stuff, then when you get to the big rocks, you can put a bunch of sand in there, some pebbles, but then you get the big rocks, there's no space. Right. And their point is you start with the big rocks and then you put in the smaller rocks and then you put the sand in and the sand filters down and fills in all the gaps. And then the best ones are the ones who then pour a beer in it because the sand just soaks up the beer. And it's like, well, what's the point of the beer? It's like, well, there's always time for a beer with a friend.
Right. Like I've seen those illustrations and thought of that. And the thing I've noticed with God is all of a sudden the jar doesn't matter anymore because he's able to do stuff outside of that jar that shouldn't fit. And for whatever reason, he finds a way to make it work. And all the things you're trying to cram in there, when you figure out they're all part of God and your faith and just a life with God, when you figure out it's all part of it, all of a sudden there's a lot more room.
Yeah, and I've noticed that's on my good days, because we all have good days and days that we sort of get sucked up into the busyness. On my good days, it's almost an act of defiance where when I'm feeling overwhelmed, It's like, you know what? No, I'm not going to do the 1 minute pause because I feel like I barely have 1 minute. I was like, I'll do a 10-minute because screw you, right?
Yeah.
Because if I feel like I don't have time, I'm going to double down and be like, God, you're the God of time and space and creation and all that. And I'm going to focus on you and depend on you for creating the margin. And it's like you said, he does, and things happen, whether that's rescheduling a podcast like we had to do because I overbooked myself. But yeah, that idea, like you start with God, because if you don't, life goes sideways.
Mm-hmm.
And life's going to go sideways anyway.
Right.
But how are we going to respond to it?
It's going to go sideways, and just in the spirit of the age, in this day and age, it's going to fill up too. And so it's just important for me to remember that, because with kids and youth sports and just all the things that come at you, it's pretty easy to, if you got tied up in that stuff and viewed it as getting in the way, like it's in the way, whether I want it to be in the way or not. And so when I, like you said, on the good days, I'm able to see that it's all part of that as well. And sometimes sitting in a lawn chair outside of a chain link fence watching a ball game, in the right frame of mind, that can be a good act of worship too. But in the wrong frame of mind, it can go south too. So yeah.
Yeah. I actually think, like I said, that question wasn't prepped or prepared, or we didn't talk about it beforehand, but I think it's a really good intro to the conversation we want to have about this movie, King Arthur, Legend of the Sword. I hadn't seen it. We were talking before. I remember seeing the trailers before this came out. I'm like, oh man, look at who's in it. You know, you've got all these like legitimate good actors, and it's a Guy Ritchie movie. Yep. And it looked awesome. And then it came out and the reviews were terrible. And so I was like, I'm not going to watch it. So I watched it yesterday, and I can understand some of the reviews, but I didn't think it was all that bad. I've seen much worse movies, much less enjoyable. And when you look at it from the perspective that we're going to look at it, it is a really powerful, moving story of the way you described it. It's an excellent illustration of man's struggle with power.
Yeah, that's the part that I just love about this movie. It's just such an illustration of how different guys handle the authority that they're given in different situations. And even just a good example of how one man struggles from moment to moment. You know, there's times where Arthur is handling power well, and there's other times where he's resisting it, or where he doesn't want it, or he's stepping out of it. And so, and that's, like we've said, that's life, and that's, you know, the good days and the bad days, you know, different reactions, and it's neat to see how much it reflects the everyday walk through that power struggle.
As you were talking about how Arthur, played by Charlie Hunnam, again, he's a dude. He was on, I think, Sons of Anarchy, which is another show I haven't watched. I've heard it's great. But as you see him, he's struggling with power, but in a different way than you see Vortigern, who's played by Jude Law, you know, the big bad guy. You know, he's struggling because he wants more power. Arthur is struggling because he doesn't want the power. And he's struggling because he's like, no, I don't want it. I don't want it. I'm just, you know, a kid born in a brothel. Mm-hmm. And yet it keeps getting put on him. And I think both of those are struggles that, I mean, we as men have at one time or another. We're either trying to get more and sacrificing everything. I mean, obviously we're not actually killing our wives and daughters, but you know, if you're working 80 hours a week, you are sacrificing your family on the altar of success and ambition and power. On the other hand, we might say, no, that's not who I don't want to do that. I don't want to do that. And so that's, I think, some of the tension that we're going to look at as we look at this movie today.
Like Jude Law, everyone he loves literally dies for him to keep gaining power. He's killing people off as the movie goes on. But like in our life, I feel like if you're fighting that hard to grow power and influence, it's pretty easy to do the exact same thing with relationships on the way up the ladder. And on the other end of it, I've been on the other end where it probably relate more to King Arthur, the version of power he's struggling with, where it's like he doesn't want it. He's resistant. He doesn't want to step into it. But there's an inheritance. There's a power that he has, whether he wants it or not. And he's being called into it and called up to step into it. And eventually it's like you get to the point where you realize that you not taking up that power is also affecting the people that are in your world. And so that's like, for me, the thing that really kicked that off. Like, obviously you get married and you realize that your life matters to somebody, but then kids are just the ultimate exclamation point on the end of that, because my ability to step into power, and then all of a sudden I've got 3 kids watching how I handle power. I'm in charge of something. They're learning whether I'm teaching or not. They're learning. So
right. What is it they say, that more is caught than taught? Seeing how you handle stuff. And that was, again, one of there were scenes in this movie that just really struck home. And as you mentioned, that was one of them when Arthur actually threw the sword back, threw Excalibur back, and then the Lady of the Lake came and intervened and said, "This is the future of England if you don't take the sword."
Right.
Yeah, we'll get to that point, because this is a different King Arthur story than you're accustomed to. Vortigern's the big bad guy played by Jude Law. He kills Uther, usurps the throne because he wants more power. He's jealous of the power, as we see. And in that initial interaction, Arthur gets, very Moses-like, sent down the river in a boat and gets picked up, is raised by these women in a brothel. And there's a montage early on that shows as Vortigern is gaining power, Arthur is being initiated. He's being beat up in the streets. He's being robbed by bullies. He's, getting knocked out of the way by the blackleg, the sheriffs and the police sort of force. We see his path of growing up and maturation is one where it's a struggle. And he's not experiencing much power, but as he's going through those growing pains, literally, because you keep seeing, the women of the brothel sort of nursing him back to health after another getting beat up again, getting his head dunked under the water after, whatever happens. And they nurse him back to health, but he's still setting aside. You see his character through that conflict.
Even early on, just to speak to that idea of seeing his character, one of the early interactions he has with Jude Law when he figures out that he's the king, he's in the lineage, and he says, like, I can just disappear, I'll just go away, nobody has to even know it was me. And Jude Law's reply to him is like, yeah, I'd like to believe that, but your character doesn't let me. And so just that idea that he could see that in him too, even the bad guy could see, like, no, this guy doesn't have the character to just disappear and let me do what I'm wanting to do here. So
yeah, that was an awesome interaction because, again, you see that montage, and then you see him as a grown man. He's running the brothel. He's managing, he's sort of the mafia of the town, where he's managing shipping. Nothing happens without him knowing about it. They talk about the coffers, and he's got chests now hidden away, filled with gold.
I love that. I love that montage, how it just shows in such a short, condensed amount of time. It shows that a bunch of bad circumstances put him in the exact position he needed to be in to help everybody around him. So it's like he had all these things that were kind of working against him, but ultimately it just made him, he ends up tough. He ends up able to fight. He ends up able to help the people in his world, and he figures out, like, how can I use these things? Basically, instead of letting all this bad stuff happen to him, he figured out how to use it as an initiation to become a man who could handle the set of cards he was dealt and the world he was living in. Like, he figured out how to make that work in that area. And so that montage to me just shows he figured that part out. But then as it is with life, like then the next thing comes in that's a little bit bigger and a higher power, and then he's on to figuring that one out.
And that really speaks to how we respond to our culture, because that's so other of how we approach it. Of we want things to be sort of easy. We want, a natural progression, linear upwards growth, always everything's up and to the right.
Mm-hmm.
But that's not actually how you grow, and it's definitely not how you develop character. What is that I think in Romans 5 it talks about all these things that suffering leads to perseverance leads to character leads to hope. And I'm butchering it. I'll put the actual verse up on the website, because that's what I do on the back end. I'm like, oh, let me fact check the quotes that we pull and all this stuff.
Yeah.
But it's through that suffering, through the conflict, that he actually becomes who he's meant to be. Like if he had grown up in the castle, sort of a child of privilege, he doesn't know what it's like to struggle to make ends meet. He doesn't know what it's like to live under the boot heel of a bigger, stronger person, because he is the biggest, strongest person in the room. And why is that lesson so necessary for us? And why do we hate getting it? Why do we hate that lesson?
Yeah. I think we hate it because it's not comfortable.
Yeah.
It's like all the things that seem to pay off big in the long run and make you really grow are usually super uncomfortable in the moment. And I mean, I know I have to make a point to be intentional to choose things regularly that are helping me grow and have a bigger perspective, and not just settle into whatever, whether it's just something easy and comfortable, or whether it's just something that I have a strength in and can kind of coast, that idea of the things that are the new frontiers, the new challenges, those are the ones that expand your kingdom and the things that you can actually have authority in. But man, the first time you do that, you don't feel like you're ready, and you're not usually. You have to kind of figure some of that out on the go, or it goes bad and tanks, and then you figure out what to do from there. And that's just not a comfortable place to be in.
So how have you experienced that, whether it's like the challenge or, I mean, maybe it's a physical backhand, but a lot of us, it's more of a metaphorical getting backhanded, getting slapped back into the street. And didn't you say one time, were you a wrestling coach?
Yeah.
So, like mixing all that stuff in, it's like you looking at that montage. When have you experienced sort of what Arthur went through as part of your growing pains?
As a coach, I always feel like my favorite thing about coaching wrestling is that it also parallels life, like this story in this movie does. And I feel like I don't know if there's a better place that I've seen to teach young men to kind of learn to step out of their comfort zone and fight through it and see the rewards than wrestling. Because it's like, if it's not going well there, somebody's taking you down and pinning you on the ground and not letting you get up, and it usually hurts pretty bad. And so, like, it's the ultimate training ground to me, just to take a young man and throw him into a situation they're not sure that they have what it takes. And usually when you start, you don't, and you have to figure out, okay, I have to humble myself enough to get beat on a little bit, and then later down the road, I might actually be tough enough to handle this situation differently. But right now I'm just learning, and so as a coach, it's fun to see that. I would say, what I've noticed when I'm watching wrestlers, the best predictor of their, basically their potential, the greatest predictor of their potential is usually their capacity to fail without getting discouraged. And I feel like that's the same for a man. That's the same thing. My potential is usually going to be limited by how much can I push into things that I could possibly fail at and risk failure and still not get discouraged and keep my head up, keep my chin up, and just keep knowing that it's all eventually going to work out for good in the end. And yeah, you throw a kid into a wrestling room with some really tough guys, and the first day he's getting beat on, and a year or two later, he may be right there with those same guys. And a lot of times they don't see it till you point it out to them. So that's fun.
I love, like you said, that whole idea of wrestling is such a sort of a model for what we experience in life. And if a kid went out there and was immediately good at it, then it's like, if it just came easy, then there's just the joy, the victory doesn't mean that much.
Right.
But if you spent months getting pinned, getting thrown around, and losing, then that first victory, that's when you see the kids jumping all around because, they worked really hard for it. And those victories that you work hard, the victories that come from failure and not getting discouraged, I think it means that much more. The victory is that much sweeter because you've experienced the blood in the mouth, right?
Right. Well, and if you're good right away, the other hard part of that is you don't stay good. You have to keep working to you aren't automatically good forever. So if you're good right now and you're in second grade, well, good luck, because you've got a long road ahead. And if you think you're already there, it's going to be harder to convince you to keep working hard enough to stay where you're at now. I've seen it a lot of times with little kids. They're pretty good, and then they think that they're good enough to just coast, and then all of a sudden 2 or 3 years later, they're not even out because they start losing and it's not as much fun. And on the other end of it, you've seen the kids that just are getting their butts kicked week in and week out, and you feel kind of bad. You're like, man, I wish that kid could win a match. And then all of a sudden, for whatever reason, down the road, they start winning and they get a little taste of it, and they learned to love the process of becoming a better wrestler while they weren't even winning. So then when they are winning, then that's when you see the progress take off, because all of a sudden now it's a lot more fun, And so the thing that you enjoyed even when it wasn't going well, now that it's going well, like, you can really make some big strides then. But even then it ebbs and flows. So you got to be able to, when you're those guys at the top, some of them will challenge the other guys at the top, and some of them just want to beat guys that they're better than.
Man, that's so good. That whole idea, when you look at those lessons, like you said, it's a microcosm of our own growth and maturity of how to fail without getting discouraged. And again, kind of drawing this back to the movie of this, that's what we see with Arthur. Like, he doesn't get discouraged, even though he's gets beat up. He keeps losing, because then he starts winning, and you get that confidence. Mm-hmm. And the confidence, we deal a lot with imposter syndrome of, you walk into a place, you're like, oh, do I even belong? Well, he doesn't need to worry about if he belongs, because like you said with those kids who've struggled for months or years, once they start winning, they're like, oh, this is how to win. This is what it takes. And you see it, like, once they get that first win, they just keep winning and winning because it clicks. Something clicked for them. And I would imagine for the kids who came in and kind of started coasting and then got hit in the mouth, it's probably harder for them to get back into the winning track, because they don't know what it takes. And so it's almost like they have to unlearn what they've learned along the way and relearn how to do it.
Right. And all of that, plus at times you also just need a good coach. You need somebody around you, a mentor, or somebody who can know whether right now is a time when you need another challenge, or right now is a time when you need a confidence boost, and that's an easy thing to see as a coach in a sporting event. It gets a little trickier sometimes in life, and you don't necessarily get to choose when the challenges come in life. And so it's just, that's the reason I feel like it's, you take the controlled challenges when you can, and you train that a little bit, and then you have something to lean on when the unexpected ones come.
And so, and we talk about adventure and the importance of adventure. And there's a sense where you engage in adventure, the things that makes your heart come alive, in order to keep your heart alive. But the other is, those are sometimes those controlled challenges where you're like, I am going to step out on a ledge Is my marriage at stake? Is my job at stake? Are my kids at stake? No. But, I'm going to do this thing that feels kind of uncomfortable. I remember several years ago, my wife and I, we did a spontaneous trip for a weekend. And I like to plan. Like, I like to have things planned out. And so this was we were going to show up to work Friday, and I was teaching at the time. So while the kids were taking the exam, I was going to see where are the cheap plane tickets.
Yeah.
And we were going to go wherever worked out for us and all this. And it was to Cleveland. And so we went to Cleveland from a Friday to a Monday, and we loved it. Actually, it was we got a hotel right across from the where the Browns play, and had a lot of fun. We went to a deserted roller coaster, a deserted amusement park. Did a little trespassing, and went to they have a big cemetery where Elliot Ness is buried, and they had some cool stuff there. Of course, the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. But I remember sitting the flight. We were supposed to go to Cleveland. Our flight got delayed, and I was worried we were going to miss our connection, and then we were going to. I'm like, I already rented a car. I already spent this money on a hotel room, stressing out. And the stakes were relatively low in the big scheme of things, right? We're not, like I said, not risking my job, my marriage, anything big.
Mm-hmm.
But to me, going through that and learning this is what it feels like to me, have my face on the mat. Am I going to trust God in this? Am I going to trust that I am walking with God? And you develop those low stake reps so that when it does become, is this the job that's for me? As you mentioned, a few years ago, you went from teaching to popcorn salesman. And when you're dealing with that transition, that question, you've got to have those reps in a or sort of safer mode so that when it does become a big question, you're able to trust where God is leading.
Yeah. So I feel like making a jump in your career can feel like a big step later. So switching from teaching to farming and selling popcorn and some of that might seem like a wild jump, but at the same time, kind of like in that montage where you see him getting trained for all the things that were to come. I grew up moving every couple of years. We moved for Dad to go work for the gas pipeline, and my parents were pretty young when I was born. So a lot of transitions just with their phases of life and also careers. So I was figuring out change all the way up. It was I grew up doing that. And so I can relate to some of when you see that montage and him kind of being where he needed to be later down the road. I've just seen that play out a number of times, and I feel like I have a high capacity for risk and for just going for it. Sometimes, much to my wife's dismay, I have a high capacity for risk. And for me, it's more of a point of I'm asking God, all right, just tell me when you want me to sit still, because I'll keep moving otherwise, and I'll keep taking chances. And I know a lot of people, it's the other way, and they're asking God, just tell me when to go, and I'm more like, all right, tell me when to sit down and stay still. Otherwise, I'm going to keep making moves here. And for whatever reason, I was in all the right scenarios from then until now to put me in the position to be that kind of a guy, And so the hard part's just been trying to figure out how to use that for a kingdom purpose instead of just using it as a selfish, I'll just hop around to the next thing. Instead, using it to figure out, all right, God, what are the things that you're guiding me to here, and how are you going to use me and use this ability that you've put in me? How's that going to work out in this scenario? And so just seeing how that all shapes up as life goes on.
Again, looking back at how your past prepared you for your current situation and not running from it and sort of accepting it and just going with the flow. And so when we go back to the movie and we see Arthur, he pulls Excalibur. He's identified as the true son, the born king is what they call him. And he's in a situation there's no way he can get out, but then the mage intervenes. She sends the giant bird, eagle, hawk thing. I don't know exactly what it was. The horses go crazy and all this stuff. And again, he's still resisting, right? He's like, no, I'm just this, I'm not this guy that you think I am. And to the point, like he can't, Excalibur has a certain power in it.
Right.
And he can't harness it. It knocks him out every time, which is a bad thing. Cause if you're drawing a sword, you're getting in a fight, and being knocked out by your sword is not a good way to win a fight.
Not so good.
Hashtag analysis. And so he has to go to the Darklands. It reminds me of in Empire Strikes Back when Luke goes into the cave on Dagobah with Yoda and faces Darth Vader, who's himself. But he's got to go face these things in order to gain control, gain mastery of the sword. And again, this movie is a lot of sort of cuts in between multiple scenes. So in this one, you even have some of the scenes where it's like, okay, he's in the Darklands fighting the crazy monster beasts there. They're on their way in another part. And then this other part that I actually pulled the clip from is the mage is talking with Sir Bedivere saying, no, he needs to go. And he's resisting. He's like, no, and the line that I have is like, you're going to kill the king before he's even had a chance to become the king.
Right.
But there's some stuff that she says on the early side of this clip that I think resonates for how we develop as men and how we sort of have to go through our own Darklands in order to become the men that we were created to be.
You know what we have to do. In order for him to control Excalibur, he needs to go to the Darklands.
That's not happening. Welcome to the Darklands.
That's the Darklands.
That's the entrance.
He needs to take the sword to the tower. He must touch the sword to the altar stone.
You're gonna miss me.
Give me another way.
There's no other way. And he has to go alone.
He can't survive the Darklands alone.
Are you scared?
I think I can manage.
You should be scared.
That's what all the fuss is about.
Don't worry, you'll soon understand what all the fuss is about.
You don't want all of him to survive. That's the point. You have to break his old self completely, wear him down. You want him to think big? Give him something big to think about.
You're playing with fire, mage, and I'm not killing the king before he's even become one.
You don't want all of him to survive. And it's so interesting. So this morning I was texting a buddy of mine. He normally comes to our Tuesday night fires, and he couldn't because he's like, because Monday he got handed a project that had to be delivered by Wednesday. And so this morning I texted, I was like, hey man, how's the project? He was like, I was up till 1:30 didn't until I physically couldn't do anything. Then up at 7, he's been to keep working on it to try to get it turned in. And he's had conversations with other companies. So I was like, oh, this other company's not looking so bad right now. He's like, I don't know, man. I've got a lot of imposter syndrome, sort of the Simon stuff going on. And my response was, oh, well, that's got to die.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, that's the easy answer is like, yeah, that's got to die. But the actual process is much, much harder.
The thing that I relate to Arthur with in this movie is you see that after that beginning montage we talked about, he had ended up in a spot where he was he was pretty well equipped to handle that scenario, where he was at. And to get to the point where he is ready to be a king, a lot of those things that came in pretty handy in that smaller kingdom that he was ruling in, like they had to die for him to be able to become the true king that he was meant to be. And I feel like that a lot of those things that for example, being able to adapt to change and all this stuff, and being flexible and not stressing about risk, like that's all great. And sometimes I have to just be willing to completely surrender to God and know that He's going to get to control this. And it's not just me being flexible enough to deal with what comes up, that some of those things you're not able to deal with, and you need something bigger than yourself in that scenario. And you can't just fall back on whatever things it was that got you to the point you're at now. And so that's what I feel like. The cool thing about this movie to me is you watch it's like a 2 hour and 5 minute movie, and he's not the king until the last 3 minutes of the movie. Right. And so for the first 2 hours of this movie, you're watching a guy becoming a king. And I feel like that's us, we're spending until the very end of this movie, we're just becoming, And so that's what I love about this, is it's just a reflection of we can keep playing it small and playing it safe, and we might have it all figured out in the spot we're in now. But if God's got some plan that He's calling you to, or something you're walking into, and you're completely outside of your comfort zone, you better be ready to let that part die and just go for it, because the whole point is becoming. And not until the very end do we often get to be the king, and step into that rule. And the whole point is just becoming along the way.
Yeah, because there's a time, because of your comfort level with risk taking, and with sort of being on the move, I'm sure there's times where sitting still is the part that feels like death.
Right.
It's like, no, I need to go do something. And God's just like, nope, wait. Like, oh, like you want to go change or try something new or do this. And you're just like, nope, you need to stay sitting here for this time period. And I would imagine that feels like death.
Well, so I moved every 2 or 3 years.
Yeah.
My whole until I was out of college. Basically, I moved every couple of years in different states as a kid, and then even spent one semester in college over in Wales, and so got to travel to
wow.
Some of the places in this movie are places like in Snowdonia and things that I've been to. So I like the landscape of this movie for that reason too. But just always moving around, and even whenever we stayed in a town, we moved houses a lot. So we were always just kind of in transition. And now, for the last almost 15 years now, we've lived on the family farm in the house that my wife was born in. Her parents lived down the road in another farmhouse. And it's cool now that I moved all the time and I was good at transition. Now my kids have grown up in a world where they've only ever lived in one house. And the trees that are 100 years old out here were planted by their great-great-grandfather, and the house was built by their family. And so it's neat to see that, just kind of, as someone who moved around a lot and would probably choose to do that, I've also learned the value in planting roots and seeing what can come from that. And so we're living in it now. We're living in the middle of a farm that's a century farm. From my wife's family. And so I feel like I get a good visual of some of the benefits of staying planted.
Yeah. I had a very similar growing up, we moved. I think by the time I was 30, I'd moved 20 something times, just different places. And like you even said, we lived in one town for like 10 years and moved 9 times within the same town. And so I've been in the house now for 14 years.
Okay.
We moved in when my wife and I got married, and it's a very hard transition. After about year 4 or 5, it became the longest place I'd ever lived in one house.
Yep.
Because like I would get frustrated when stuff would break down or I'd have to fix it, because if you're moving all the time, something breaks down, you just move.
Yeah.
Like, I'm just going to get a different house. Yeah. And it's like, oh no, now I need to fix the house I live in.
Right.
And engage in it. Cause it frustrated me. I'd be like, I hate this house, this piece of crap house. And like, oh, this is sort of what you do when you stay in one place. You maintain it. Stuff isn't going to last forever.
Well,
you have to learn that.
Not only to fix it, but to fix it well enough that it's going to be good and possibly in good shape for somebody behind you, and it's not like you just leave whatever you did for somebody you're never going to talk to. Like you might be fixing something in this house for your kid someday, and so it changes the way you fix something if you have a long-term view of a house or of just anything, Yeah,
I think last year, 2 years ago, our back deck was starting to get rotten, the boards, and so I was like, oh well, we're gonna change out. I put composite instead of the wood because I'm like, I don't want to stain it. The staining sucks. I was like, I don't want to do that every year, every 2 years. When we got to the stairs, I had friends who knew this sort of thing that came in and helped. I was like, okay, well, we can do a fix that'll fix it for about 2 or 3 years, or we can fix it for 10. It's going to be a little more expensive, a little more time consuming. I was like, let's do the 10-year one, because I don't want to think about it for another long time.
Right.
We were like, okay, well, we got to take the stringers down. We got to lay a concrete pad at the foot. We got to put new stringers because the other ones were cracking. And so, yeah, it was a lot of work, but it's like, well, now I don't have to, now it's fixed.
Right.
Like you were saying, it's like, it's not going to be a concern 2, 3, 4 years from now. It's something that it's like, yeah, it took a little more time, took a little more money, but it's good now.
Right. So back to your question, I used to look at some guys guys that we both kind of have known and seen at different events we've been to together. And I'd look at some of these guys and I would think they kind of had stuff figured out and that they had fixed some things. And like, so I even had probably to them some awkward conversations, because at times I was just silent, like looking at the guy, like trying to figure out what's going on there, So yeah, I probably owe an apology to Morgan or Aaron or some of those guys that just to tell them like, sorry if that one was a little strange, but I was trying to figure out like, what are these guys doing, or what do they have going on that, and to me it felt like if I could just talk to them, get in proximity, like they're going to tell me some tip or trick or thing that helped them. And that's what made the difference. And the more I got around all of these, a number of guys, whether it was just guys here in Iowa or guys off in different parts of the country or the world that I've run into, it's like you figured out they all had the same thing. And what they all had was like what you see in this movie. There was a higher power. There was they have God. And you get close to him and you figure out, oh, that guy's just as screwed up as I am. He's just walking with God in the middle of it. And from a distance, it's easy to think that somebody else had a different set of circumstances or had a different skill set or had this or that or something was given to him. And then when you get close, you realize the circumstances don't matter, because I've talked to a number of guys and they all have different circumstances. But then the thing that I was seeing, the thing that was drawn to me in all those guys was kind of how they were walking in that authority, like what you see in this movie. Like they'd become the kind of guy, the kind of king that God could give power to. And what I was seeing was the beginning stages of a man walking in that kingdom authority and that power. And like this, back to that clip, I mean, this movie just is such a good example of there's certain things that you could play off of in your strengths or your situations, but ultimately when it comes down to it, like that all kind of has to die. And what you need is, like in this movie, what he needs is just to surrender to the power of that sword and realize that there's more to it than him. And obviously we need to do the same thing. And we have a power that's right there for us to take up. And it's not like it's a one-time decision. I mean, it's a minute by minute decision. Right. A lot of days. It's not even day by day. It's like you just finish a prayer time and then you walk into the house and one kid's throwing something at another one. You got to maybe make that decision again. And so,
how are you going to respond?
Right. And so it's just the learning to more often choose to walk in that power versus in my own, and realizing that there's a bigger kingdom at hand and there's a bigger story. And so she talked about in there, you want him to think big, give him something big to think about. And that's been the thing over time, is just realizing that there's something, there's always more available. And I think that's one of the things, as it's whether I'm as a coach or a dad, I feel like that's the frontier that lately that I feel like God's been calling me into, is like step into that even more, whether it's just to show people that it's available or whether it's to step in and say something. And, in a situation where maybe I just want to say like, oh, I'll just try and lead by example, maybe it's time to speak up every once in a while. And you can usually tell, I can usually tell because I can feel like I'm supposed to say something here and I don't want to. And so just trying to step more into those situations. I usually get a pretty strong sense of when I'm supposed to jump a fence and go for it. And I'm trying to jump more of those fences, figuratively and literally, wherever it's going on.
Well, that's the line. He says, you're going to kill the king before he has an opportunity to become a king. Mm-hmm. And because that's the fear talking, right? Mm-hmm. On the other hand, like if he's meant to be the king, nothing can take that away.
Right.
Like there's nothing to be afraid of. If he's meant to be king, he's going to be the king. Mm-hmm. Like whatever we have to go, because we get, like you said, that failure will discourage us. Failure will feel like defeat. Mm-hmm. Like you were talking about those kids you can see the kids in high school and as wrestlers, they might be killing it. You're like, oh my gosh, this kid's amazing. But you don't see him in elementary and junior high when he was struggling every time and he thought about giving up, and, or his parents, his life at home might be awful, but he keeps showing up because that's where he has somebody speaking into him.
Right.
But you only see the match day.
Right.
You don't see the diet. You don't see the making weight. You don't see all the work, the lifting and stuff that goes into it.
They'll say like, how is that kid so resilient? And usually it had nothing to do with a wrestling practice. I mean, it's usually some kid that had a bad set of circumstances and he ended up being able to push through, because in the big scheme of things, a wrestling match was not that hard to push through compared to some of the stuff that he dealt with in life. Right. And so, usually like people like to think like, oh yeah, I wish I could do that, or I wish that this kid could do that. And really it's like, I don't know, you careful what you're wishing on him, because the way that guy developed that talent or that ability was usually through some suffering that maybe you wouldn't wish on someone. And so I feel like that's the thing that overlaps for me. I mean, the idea in this movie and seeing him being someone who kind of pushes through that and also is pulling guys along with him and kind of feeding off of their strength at times. Obviously in athletics, that's an important part of it. But that's also been important to me, just having a group of guys around that on the days where, when you have your bad days, you've got somebody else to help you keep fighting ahead, keep pushing through, and just to remind you of who you are and what power is available on the days when it doesn't feel like it. It's easy when you're the one telling somebody else, oh yeah, just push through here, this will be worth it in the end. Yeah. But it's hard whenever, when you're the guy that's suffering, whether it's in an athletic event or especially when it's in life, and you're suffering through a tough season, and then you're not thinking usually, oh, this will really be good in the long run,
Right. Yeah, when you're the one with your face pressed against the mat,
Right.
and somebody's over there saying, "Get up, get up." You're like, "I'm trying. I'd like to get up if I knew how."
That's a great idea. You're right. I should get up.
It's much easier to be the one saying, "Get up."
Yeah.
So it's interesting how our conversation has gone. This movie had a lot of really good themes that we're not going to get a chance to touch on. There's the scene where he tries to throw the sword and the Lady of the Lake shows him, if you don't become who you're meant to be, this is what England will look like. And we all have those moments. She's like, you have a role to play. And if you don't do it, no one will. And it might not be global. It might be with your kids or your grandkids or those kids that you were coaching or the kids who hang out in the popcorn truck that you have an opportunity to engage with on a daily, weekly basis, just to love on them and intervene. And we all have those opportunities if we don't let the failure discourage us.
Mm-hmm.
And so I want to jump to the end of the movie, and Vortigern and Arthur are fighting. And earlier you had mentioned Vortigern had asked Arthur, what is it that drives you? And Arthur didn't have an answer. He's like, I don't know. I'm just a kid who grew up in a brothel. I'm nobody. And he has an opportunity. He has finally faced all the things that he's had to face. He's gone through his initiation and he's ready to face the big bad guy with confidence and you don't see any fear. And so he answers the question. He's like, you asked me what did it? And he's going to tell him. And it's it's a little bit, I don't think it's a longer scene, but there are some parts of this clip where there's just fighting. Mm-hmm. So as this clip is playing, I want you guys to be considering, as you look back at your life, answering the questions of, when Arthur says a line, where has that applied to you getting, whether it's your face to the mat or knocked down in the street, or when you faced failure and defeat? How has that shaped you, or how can that shape you in the way that Arthur's describing as he's fighting with Vortigern?
You wanted to know what gave me such drive. It was you. You put me in that brothel. You caught me on the streets. I am here now because of you. You created me.
And man, that's Joseph right there. What you meant for evil, God used for good.
Mm-hmm.
And we all have those moments in our lives. And I'm feeling emotional by this because to me, it's a very energizing scene of, yeah, you did, like, we look at God and be like, yeah, God uses, but when we have the opportunity to actually face the enemy and be like, yeah, you did this thinking it would take me out. but it didn't. I'm here in spite of what you did.
Right.
And I became your worst nightmare. I became the one to take you down because you sent all this shit at me and I didn't let it defeat me. I didn't let it discourage me. I kept fighting. And that's why I think that's such a moving scene for me, is that it's because it is gospel. It's straight from scripture. What you meant for evil, God's going to use for good and the deliverance of his people, because that's what you see in that moment.
I grew up in a church family, church worker family and everything. And all the things that I used to view as things that would maybe things that were meant for evil, or things that would disqualify me from being used by God. Like, I've just seen it play out over time. It's basically, I mean, it's like this. It created me. It made me into the person that I needed to be able to reach some people that are out on the edges of faith, and maybe some people that wouldn't be comfortable with, they're less comfortable with a pastor and more comfortable with a wrestling coach, popcorn guy, farmer, around a campfire or sitting and having a beer. And it's just made me realize that all those things that maybe when I was younger that I would have viewed as something to disqualify me, God's turned all of that around and reframed it into something that has given me a reach and a power that, man, you can be pretty dangerous for good if you take all of those things that the enemy meant to disqualify you from things, and you turn those into as fuel or as ammo to do good. I mean, yeah. And it also, some of that too, it just builds up a resilience or a defiance in you. It's like, I don't know. When I see somebody who's in a place that I would have been in 20 years ago, thinking they were disqualified from things, it's like, all right, here we go. We're going to go, we're going to help that guy. We're going to reach out to him and just let him know that he's got people, like in this scene, he's got guys that are reaching out and helping. And then in the end, eventually you step out on your own and you realize that when you have that power, when you have all those experiences, it can turn into something for the rest of this movie, that Vortigern had been, the bad guy had been something that not even his dad was able to defeat earlier, but then him being a king who also was raised on the streets and had all of this resilience and all these things in his background, that put him in a position to not quit when other people maybe would have. When you see him down and out in parts of it, not only is he stepping into the power that's bigger than him with the Excalibur, with the kingdom, but also like he's fallen back on being a tough kid that was raised in, with a lot of hardship and a lot of those things. And so it's funny how God can use the combination of the little things over time that turn you into the man you are, plus he can take that and just exponentially grow it by just sprinkling himself into it, a little bit at a time. And you get glimpses of it at times, and other times you're wishing it was more of it. And then all of a sudden, every once in a while, you get a big dose of it and you go like, all right, that's cool. And that's available. And the more that I feel like I've felt that in life and seen that, like, I want more of that. Not only do I want more of that, I want my wife and kids to see that in me, and I want them to see that in themselves. And I want to create an environment in my home and in my community where people see that. And so I've just made a point to more and more not worry about the externals as much. It doesn't matter if I'm teaching in a classroom or coaching in a wrestling room or farming or selling popcorn, like that's all great. But in every one of those situations, what I want them to see is what's inside of me. And I want them to feel the environment that I want them to feel God through all of that.
Yeah.
And so whether I'm handing somebody a bag of popcorn or teaching them to take somebody down, like, I want them to know that there's a higher power, and I want them to feel kind of that come through in all areas. And so that's been just that idea of just even more is available. And I like to stress that to people. And some people, you can go into more of what the even more is and talk about Ephesians and verses that build into that, and John 10:10, and sometimes you just say even more is available, and that's enough. And they know that they can feel that there's something there, and they don't know what it is, and maybe they're the one just awkwardly sitting there like I was with some of these other guys earlier on, and they can tell something more is there, but they don't know what it is yet. And eventually, when they need it, it'll be there. Just planting those seeds along the way.
Well, Clay, I think there was definitely more in this conversation, and definitely the Spirit of God came through in this. And I really appreciate you taking the time and rescheduling. I think at least once. We might have had to reschedule a couple of times. And your persistence. And this has been a really awesome, fun conversation that I've really enjoyed it. And I hope people enjoyed listening to us go back and forth.
Yeah. And I just want to say thanks, Paul, and for not only for just this conversation, but for what you do. I've enjoyed other episodes of this, and just hearing you talk to guys and give them a place to use these stories to tell a bigger story. But also just off the air, getting to sit next to you out in the middle of the mountains, whether it was after diving into a cold body of water and you're sitting there smiling in a hot tub when we all tried to go running and dive in next to you and warm up, and or sitting in a chair next to you in a room. I just always noticed that you've got a smile on your face a lot of times, and you were just somebody that was easy to talk to right off the bat. And so I appreciate the chance to talk to you again today.
Oh, thank you, Clay. I appreciate that. And anytime you want to come back and talk about another movie, you just let me know. The door is open for you.
Sounds good. Thank you.
All right. So this has been Paul McDonald and Clay Eaton talking about King Arthur, the Legend of the Sword. Go check it out. It's not that bad. It's much better than the reviews would say. So hope you guys enjoyed it. And I hope you join us next time here on the Men at the Movies podcast.
Something inside has been awakened. I can no longer be who I was before. But if I am no longer who I was, who am I to be?